Good evening, class, and welcome to week three, module three of our online course about women's rights and the suffrage movement, first wave feminism. This week, we're going to be discussing women's rights, the actual movement, as well as the temperance movement. Before we begin, I'd like to just review quickly. We discussed in module one the cult of domesticity and the expectations of 19th century women, focusing mainly on the private sphere, working in home, becoming wives, good mothers with morals. Women were also treated as property when it came to their fathers as well as their husbands. There was lack of protection under the law, which we'll get into further today with Module 3. There was also a belief that women were weak, dainty, emotional, and unable to function in society without the support of a man. And in week 2, we discussed the abolition movement and how it gave birth to the women's rights movement. Harriet Beecher Stowe, who appealed to the mothers with Uncle Tom's Cabin, her older sister, who also contributed to the women's rights movement. We also talked about how Angelina Grimke and other abolitionists focused on their voices within the movement, but they were denied simply because they were women. They were also told that it was important to fight for human equality in the abolition, and women should put their own concerns to the side before until after the abolitionist movement was truly successful. So let's dive into Module 3, keeping the first two modules in mind. As I'm discussing this, please recall some of your readings following this lecture. We are going to have time to discuss our documents that were required reading for this week. So let us dive in. Per usual, these are our objectives for the class today. Go ahead and read through them. This PowerPoint is available to you. So the 19th century woman. Typically, we discussed in week 1 the daintiness of a woman. You can see it through fashion. It's supposed to emphasize the fact that women could not function without the assistance of a man. Overly large skirts, trying to make their waists look small. They're supposed to be appealing to the man. Then women are supposed to be in the private sphere, not to go out into the public sphere. They are meant to be property and work for the man. And they are supposed to rear their children. They were supposedly property, and they were, they were to do the cooking, the cleaning, the child rearing, small education for the children, rhetoric, very simple mathematics. But women were also to be treated however a man wanted to treat them. They were supposedly property. And we're going to discuss the mistreatment of women this week with this module, especially this argument of the mistreatment of women and it giving emphasis to the temperance movement. So typically when we're looking at first wave feminism and we're looking in the 19th century, the mid 1800s, there are 4 main goals of this movement: voting rights and politics, education and employment, property and wages, and equality in marriage. And we're going to dive deeper into all 4 of these following slides. So women's suffrage was really the priority for the movement all the way through the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Um, by giving this particular right to women, they could in turn fix all the other problems. They could find the law to work for them instead of against them. And we're going to see here in our discussion how the law was working against them. So, um, there was nowhere in this country in the 19th century that was allowing women to vote, whether it be in federal elections, state elections, even small local elections. There might have been some very, very small places, but overall, the United States did not allow women to vote. Women were also not allowed to hold public office. And therefore, by not having actual representation to follow the needs of these women, obviously it was as though they were treated as second class citizens, if they were even considered to be citizens, because they were also considered to be property. Um, Actually, in the world, before 1893, there was nowhere that women could vote. New Zealand was the first of the countries around the world to actually legalize women's suffrage. That was in 1893. Now, it took the United States all the way until 1920 to also allow women to vote. But that's more second wave feminism. That's going to be closer to the end of our modules, closer to the end of our time together in week 8. We're going to be discussing that. But in the early ages of our republic, there was a situation where New Jersey allowed women as well as freed blacks to vote. And this was over the course of a few decades. And it worked for a while, but then there was an election where things didn't go the way that men wanted it to go. And for that, women lost the right to vote, and so did freed blacks. So I digress with that fun fact, but voting in politics in this time period, women are not going to be getting the appropriate representation because they are not the ones that are able to vote. They are not the ones that are able to fight for their rights, for justice, for the sufferings that they are subjected to in this time period. So, by actually allowing women to vote, I wouldn't have to discuss the rest of the other 3 goals. But moving forward, education and employment. Women were able to get education. It was actually promoted for elementary education, simple education as far as rhetoric, things that could make them better wives and mothers. But there were not opportunities for higher education for women in the United States. And if there was any higher education, they were typically going to be focused on elementary education or something that might be geared more towards an appropriate female job, literature. There were other male dominated fields like medicine, law, sciences that women were not able to actually participate in. There are some opportunities that women had, and it was not very common, but one woman in particular, Elizabeth Blackwell, was one to put a little crack in that glass ceiling. She went to Geneva Medical School in New York, where she was the first woman in the United States to receive a degree in medicine. She then dedicated the rest of her life to opening up hospitals and infirmaries for women and children. She also ended up studying gynecology, obstetrics. She was truly trying to make the world a better place for women with her power that was maybe considered a male power in this time period. But, this was not a common practice for women, and even in her field, she had a lot of ridicule. She was not considered a serious scientist. She was not accepted into, particular groups and lectures, but we do look at her as one of our pioneers of feminists during this time period. Another woman who was looking to better the education opportunities for women during this time period was a teacher by the name of Mary Lyon. Mary Lyon worked on opening a school known as Mount Holyoke Seminary for Women. And this school was dedicated to a rigorous, academically focused female school, the first of its kind in our country. And this would actually be the college that Emily Dickinson, the famous novelist, would attend. And she actually can give a lot of her success to Mary Lyon and her founding of this rigorous college. Now, looking at employment opportunities, women were not typically going to be working. We discussed in the first module that our women that we're going to be talking about in this class are going to be mainly middle class to higher class who are going to be focusing on fighting for the rights of women. But in lower class homes, some working class homes, it is necessary for women to work. Um, and it also is going to provide an opportunity for women to work if they're unmarried. So, in particular, the Mill Girls, most famously, we have the Lowell Mill Girls in Massachusetts. Women were able to work in these factories. They were textile factories, and they were provided boarding houses that were run by typically a man and a woman, or there would be a woman in charge. The girls who were living in these boarding houses were held to higher moral standings. And the reasoning for that was simply because they were women. If you looked at the treatment of men throughout this time, if they weren't working, they were not watched over like these Mills girls were. They had to have moral standards. They were supposed to be in at a certain time. They were supposed to attend church. They were not supposed to be using crude behavior, etc. So the Mill Girls are actually one of the strongest feminists of this time period as far as employment is concerned. Yes, I talk about all of these negative things as far as the treatment of women in the boarding houses, but this was a way that they could feel a sense of independence. They were able to move away typically from their farming houses, away from their parents, and they earned a paycheck in this time period. Yes, it wasn't a lot because they are going to be paid less than men, but they are going to feel some sort of financial independence. And in these boarding houses, there was a sisterhood, and they looked out for one another. And when there was mistreatment, there is an opportunity for strike. There is going to be successful strikes amongst the Mill Girls. In Lowell, Massachusetts, there was a strike. Let me look through my notes. I want to make sure I get it right. In 1835, one of the women was told that the wages were going to fall, that they were not going to be paid what they were supposed to be paid. And she took her green hat and she held it up in the air to show the rest of the girls that it was time to go on strike. And it was a successful strike. Therefore, giving a lot of power to women that was not really something that we saw in this time period. Now, we have women who are working with the Lowell Mill, but also women who are working if they were married. It's going to be a very different situation. Now, these women, the mill girls who were unmarried, once they got married, any savings that they might have had, any property they might have acquired, are going to go toward their husbands right away. So next, excuse me one moment. Next, we're going to be addressing property and wages. Property as far as the woman, the body, the soul, the mental state, but also the property that men are going to be in charge of during this time period, including the children. And wages, the fact that wages are relinquished to the man during this time period. So any hard work that a woman might have had, and during this time period, unfortunately, there was child labor as well. Any sort of wages that these children would have accrued during this time period would have earned, it all would have gone into a man's pocket. It would have gone into the husband's pocket. Now, the purpose of this was because the husband, the father, was meant to take care of the family. Unfortunately, they didn't always see that role as necessary. They saw this money as this was my property. I worked my property worked hard for this, and I get to do whatever I want with this money. And we'll see that with the temperance movement. But widows, we're going to talk about the law on widows. Widows typically didn't inherit the property from a man. Any sort of property would have been turned over to the next male kin, whether it be a son or a brother to the husband, or even back to a father. Divorce, thank you, Henry VIII, who made that possible during during the Protestant Reformation. But so divorce did happen during this time period. And if a man wanted to divorce their wife for any particular reason, the wife would not get their children. She would not be eligible to get her children, not only because she wouldn't be fit, typically because she wouldn't have her own finances, she wouldn't have her own job, she wouldn't have her own home because none of that was her property, but because the children were also the man's property. So, even though we have all of this money going to the husband, the husband is going to be using their money however they want. They should be paying bills because the women were probably not going to be using the bills. If they needed something done on the home, or if they needed a contract of some sort, women were not legally able to write or receive contracts. They were considered to have no legal identity apart from their husband. If someone was sued in the house, it couldn't be a woman either because it was they had no legal identity. But moving forward, husbands, like I said, were misusing these funds, and that's going to bring a huge inequality in the marriage. Women can't have any say in their financial decisions, even if they're working, even if they are, if they had an inheritance from their family, even if they had a dowry coming into the marriage. There was no way of a woman to follow societal expectations to actually be able to add to a financial decision. The same thing goes with child rearing. Yes, the wife was in charge of actually caring for the children, but when it came to sending them to school or sending them to an apprenticeship or even a marriage match, there really wasn't any say for a woman because she was just property. Excuse me one moment. In addition, women and children as property is protected under the law. Therefore, if there was mistreatment and abuse or abandonment of children or wives, um, there's not going to be really anyone looking out for them. Very similar to what we discussed with the abolition movement and the treatment of Black Americans who were enslaved, and how they were not protected as human beings under the law. Well, the same thing's going to be happening here. If someone wasn't behaving, they would be beat. Women would also sometimes be gagged if they were speaking out, um, and other horrendous things happening to women. But the law didn't do anything to stop it. Now, there was a call for a partnership. Looking back, women were looking at Enlightenment philosophers like Mary Wollstonecraft, or Mary Estelle, who called for equality in marriage, as they fought against absolute monarchy. Why is there absolutism in marriage? There were women who were citing those practices, those ideas, those philosophies. So that's the kind of equality that they're looking for in marriage, a partnership. Now, the temperance movement. So, this is one of the ways that the feminists wanted to address those four goals. Now, if we got rid of something that is causing so much pain in a marriage and ruining the men, then maybe we could lead to success in those goals that they have, those four goals. So, the temperance movement is a call to end the consumption of alcohol. As you can see from this primary source, help me to keep him pure. Please vote against the sale of liquors. So, it is a wife and a child who are looking quite angelic, almost looking like Mary and baby Jesus. They are voting to keep their father and husband pure. Alcohol in this time period, those who were supportive of the temperance movement were arguing that men were mistreating women and children, abusing them because they were so drunk, or they were squandering away all of the funds of the wages that the family has earned and not caring for basic needs for the family: clothing, food, shelter. And they're going to be living in a poor life. Finally, there's also the argument that men are abandoning their families, so drunk in a stupor at the pub or the local saloon that they don't come home, and everyone is distraught without the father and the husband. These are the arguments that they're going to have for the temperance movement. Excuse me. All right, excuse me. So, the temperance movement was a political movement, even though women were not granted suffrage during this time period. Women did not hold public office. They did participate in petitioning for the outlaw and prohibition of alcohol. Excuse me. So the temperance movement is going to be mildly successful. It is going to eventually bring us to prohibition. But they're calling this not only a moral law and a moral fight, but also a feminist fight, because this, by getting rid of alcohol, men are going to be more responsible, men are going to be more caring, men are going to be taking care of their family as they are meant to be. There were women like Carrie Nash who felt very strongly about this situation. Carrie Nash was a Quaker, surprisingly, as she has a hatchet in her hand, which is very unpacifist of her. But anyway, she was a temperance activist and feminist who took matters into her own hand. As she's holding open the Bible with a hatchet in her hand, she's also known as the Hatchet Granny. Um, she would actually open the doors to pubs and saloons. She would quote the Bible, and then she would continue to destroy the bar, destroy the contents, whiskey barrels, any bottles of gin she found. She led. It wasn't just her. There was a group of them. You could see that in the bottom right hand corner over here. This particular picture is of her and her followers who would go in mobs to these pubs and would wreak havoc. So she's almost a comical person, but you could see in this middle picture on the top here, she's seen as a savior, as a warrior, a soldier. Um, and she is a huge part of the temperance movement, and she struck fear in those who were anti-temperance movement, for those who were owning these saloons, even the men that were going to these saloons. So it was really, she really is quite a interesting character. She would actually sing hymns, uh, and she would be dressed in black and white clothing, march into the saloon. She would sing, she would pray, she would hurl Bible sounding video pictures and smash bar fixtures with a hatchet. So um, I laugh very hard about this because she really is. She's such a badass for this time period. She's really very awesome, and she's very strong um, for this time period. And she she's definitely one of the extremists during this time period, similar to the suffragettes, which we're going to be discussing later in the module about Alice Paul and what she learns during the British movement. So this is our extremist of the temperance movement. So moving forward, so this concludes my presentation. I want to open up the class now to the discussion about the readings, discussion about a couple of things that you may have learned. If you have any questions, please, please, please ask me. I look forward to hearing what you all say. So go ahead, I'll open up the floor to you now. Thank you.